So I did something I never did before. I painted the same figure twice. Why? Let's find out. What's up, pigment pushers? First video as a full-time content creator. What a fancy word. Let me start by saying thank you for the outpour of support, all the positive and supportive messages, all the comments. This was the video with the most comments I ever had, and thanks to all the new patrons that decided to back me up on this new endeavor. If you want to know my release schedule and get an update on everything that is planned, check out the video I uploaded 3 days ago. I'm excited to do this, and hopefully you are excited for lots of new videos. So let's jump right into today's topic. A French company called Raphael decided to have non-metallic metal in their box arts because it allowed them to control where the highlights go on the armor and the weapons, instead of having to rely on metallics to look interesting on photos. And it also allowed them to have a completely distinct art style to set their game apart from other competitors in the wargaming community. Of course, this is not a new concept to art because metallic pigments were not around forever, and painters had to recreate properties of metal with non-metallic pigment. But this is not the ultimate guide to non-metallic metal, so let's jump right into the experiment. I painted really similar figures in the past, but I could never bring myself to paint the exact same figure a second time. For this video, however, it made sense to take the same figure and to paint one of them in metallics and one of them in non-metallic metal. I made an effort to even make the bases look similar, so I took some cursed city terrain, molded it, and put 2 similar pillars on each of the bases. I wanted to paint these with rather similar principles, but not necessarily identically, which wouldn't even make sense because a lot of the properties of metallics and regular acrylic paint are different, and it's not always possible to create the same effect or even a similar effect. And from a composition standpoint, sometimes a non-metallic gold will look way different from a metallic gold and won't fit the composition, and vice versa, of course. Also, this is not a video about which one is better. If anything, it is going to be a video about which one I like better. Because how do you even objectively identify what is better? But there is a small problem, which is I use all of these techniques unconsciously already. So I wanted to take a step back and pay attention to what works better in one approach or the other, and why, and make a list about everything that comes up while I paint. A good exercise to understand light on a figure and its volumes, regardless of which approach you want to take, is always to prime the model with a satin black and study how the reflections behave. It gives you a good idea where to place your highlights and shadows, and you can even learn a lot about primary and secondary reflections, or bounce lights for metal parts. Which doesn't work that great with zenithal priming, because especially when you do non-metallic metal, you will want to paint more than one big reflection. You can play with directional light by lighting the scalp from one side, or use different light setups to get some inspiration. You can then just snap a picture and use it as a reference. So let's start with the metallic version. I applied 1 coat of bright metallics because I always shade down metals with regular acrylics anyway, and this way I can apply a lot of layers without making the metals too dark in the mid-tone area. Once the initial coat had a consistent coverage, it was time to shade the areas, but also to bring a bit of liveliness and color into the metals. Unlike with non-metallic metal, you can get somewhat good results with metallics quickly, with inks and washes and oil paints, but to really make an impression, we got to create areas of light and darkness. And adding non-reflective pigments as shades adds an additional layer of contrast, because reflective parts and dull parts contrast nicely against each other. I went over how different contrasts work and how they can complement each other in this video a while ago. The color I used to create these reflective and non-reflective patterns on the sword and the armor was a blue-gray. And for the shield, the goal was to use sepia tones to create more like a brass feeling. I preferred to do materials other than steel this way, instead of starting with brass or gold metallic colors, because I have more control over the final hue this way, and generally the colors look more lively and intense. I was adding a yellow ink to shift the tone of the shield more towards a brass or gold color, and I did the same for the chainmail patterns to add variety and then also added some more black to the gray base mix and tried to create deeper shadows. With the chainmail, it's enough to cover the recesses. On the shield, I paid attention to the larger volume, which is a flat dome, and I shaded the lower half only. So as I continued with the steel parts, I kept defining the shapes by deepening the shadows with the gray mix, and I tried to create interesting reflection patterns. That is really similar to how we would paint non-metallic metal. We do this because we want to have control over what's happening. To set up the rust, we need a darker red-brown that represents the rust slowly creeping into the metal before we can apply the typical red-orange color of rust. I usually try to stick to a controlled chaos pattern. Variety is key to create credible rust. On some areas like the sword, I'm also tinting the reflective areas to add additional variety and to represent something that is really rusty. Then using scrag brown, I was mixing a consistency that allowed me to control exactly where the paint would go in small but opaque amounts, as you can see on my thumbnail. And I established the orange-brown rust areas. Applying all of these layers over the metallics can obscure and dull down some areas that we want to be reflective instead. So what you see here is me preparing a layer of metallics to bring back the shine, but avoiding transitions that are too harsh as much as this is possible with metallics. For this, I get rid of most of the paint until the layers that the brush leaves are thin and rather dry. I brush it over the areas with different pressure on the brush, as you can see here, depending on the result I want. Using a mix of black and turquoise, I created a verdigris similar to the way I did with the rust, which means I'm establishing a darker layer before I added some white to the mix and covered a smaller area with it. I'm also using a bit of turquoise to add a blue tint to the armor in the midtones to make the steel look a bit less boring. I always take a step back and analyze my results after each finished element. So after the armor was finished, I thought that the shield was looking a bit too similar. So I prepped my brush to be able to apply a couple of thin layers of the white aluminium again to make this major reflection a bit more visible. Then I took a yellow ink and tinted the metallic area and blended the colors together with a last layer of flesh wash, which is similar in tone to the burnt sienna I used to achieve the color of the shield. For the non-metallic metal, we need a nice base color that is not too boring. So I use rust gray, which is a desaturated blue, and mix it with black. And I built these initial layers with transparent paint, so the black can still shine through in the areas I want it to be darkest. The shapes of the metal parts dictates how I hold my brush. Like on that rounded edge of the blade, you can see that I use a different line pattern than on the straight parts. One thing that using normal pigment that isn't metallic pigment is that you can create really smooth layers and transitions, which actually is closer to how metal reflections look, and you can't quite do that with the bigger metallic pigment. So at this point we can already assess that neither non-metallic metal nor metallics are optimal ways to create representations of the real thing. Both are just compromises. Gradually mixing in more rust gray, I start to add layers that cover less and less area, using a combination of stippling to apply more opaque colors, and then blending the layers together with thinner layers and pigment pushing. What I want you to realize through this is that painting is not about just using one technique, one brush stroke from start to finish, but you can see that I vary both the color consistency and the way I apply the paint as I build the gradients and textures. A last layer of pure white is important to sell the effect of metal reflections. Here's another example of a secondary reflection or rim light that will help us sell the illusion of metal in the final pictures. So both these results are about the same time investment. And I haven't even applied any weathering to the non-metallic version at this point. So initially, metallics look a lot quicker and effective, but if you really want to make your metallics look interesting and sophisticated, you can sink a lot of time into them. Like, you can try to add more color shifts and color variations, make the transitions as smooth as you can, and increase the contrast. Some of these initial observations are what I think led to an interesting idea within the community, but that is often due to the fact that yes, you can apply one coat of metallics, slap a wash on, and have a somewhat decent result in a few minutes, and then a lot of painters try to do the same thing with non-metallic metal. And of course, that's not going to fly because you're not really imitating any of the properties of metal. And of course, if you're going to call that non-metallic metal, you're going to hate it. So what they really hate is bad non-metallic metal. For the shield again, I wanted a brass effect. So starting off with a base coat of English Uniform by Vallejo, and black, I'm adding a desaturated midtone of Bela Brown to create these initial reflection patterns. And I also add some green to vary the color tone slightly and add more richness. This is what I mentioned before. It's so much easier to add different hues to non-metallic metal to make it more interesting. It makes me feel a lot more artsy for sure. Using a saturated yellow for the first layer of a brighter reflection and then gradually transitioning into white, I'm establishing the main reflection. Some orange brown adds even more color variety in the midtones. And the verdigris is exactly the same approach I used for the metallics. For the trim, I'm adding more of a salmon copper color. For the trim, I'm going for a more salmon or copper color. I got a more in-depth guide how I do that in my ever chosen entry video. Applying rust to non-metallic metal is tricky. You want to make sure not to cover the white that represents our reflections, because the orange, brown or white areas makes everything look funky and not credible. So unlike with the metallics, I focused the rust areas on the dark parts. Other than that, I used the same colors and gradually build up the typical orange-brown rust color. I finished the miniatures out by painting the bone in a dark beige scheme and the rags in a desaturated orange. What I found interesting was that I felt like a cool blue would suit the metallics version better, probably because of the red rust already taking up so much space of the mini, and it would look too monochromatic. What was left to do at this point was to paint the base and to wrap everything up by cleaning up the base trim. I won't show all of this because it doesn't really have a relevance to the topic of the video, but as always, you can see each step from this video more in depth on my Patreon page, where I usually upload full guides to all figures I paint. So if you want to understand more in depth how I did these metallics or the non-metallic metal or the clothes or the bone, as well as accessing all my back catalog of guides, why not join the Patreon and level up your painting? So which of the two do I like better? If I look at the result, I'd say I like both, but I guess I just enjoy the process of painting the non-metallic metal a bit more because it feels a lot more like painting to me. While true metallic metals feel a bit like technical paints with the alternating application of metal pigments and then the washes and the rust and so on. I feel like both have their place in miniature painting and certainly in my miniature painting, and I don't want to miss either of the two approaches. Especially when it comes to weathered metals, I feel like metallics are more suited and more credible for the topic. Both non-metallic metal and true metallics have to create contrast, and with true metallics it's more about creating a contrast of reflective areas versus dull areas, while with non-metallic metal you're mainly working with value contrasts. But with true metallics, you still have reflective surfaces even in the shaded areas, so you will always have a few artificial highlights as you move it around. The reflections will follow you, but that can of course be a desired effect. Non-metallic metal allows for an approach that is closer to how illustration works. You can control how big the reflections should be, how many there are, like you can work in a rim light or secondary reflections, and you can decide to have the surroundings reflected in non-metallic metal too, since it's easier to create more vibrant colors within the reflections. All of that is not really possible with true metallics. That said, I absolutely love how this area looks, where I painted highlights with scratches on a dull surface, and as you turn it around, light plays on it and it just looks gorgeous, and you can never do this with non-metallic metal. But because the pigments of metal are so grainy, even with a smoother color like the Vallejo airbrush metal colors, you will never get the smoothness you can achieve with non-metallic metal. So there's many pros and cons to each of these techniques, and like with so many aspects of miniature painting, it becomes a matter of choice and desired end result. And it's up to you to pick which one is best suited for your project. Personally, I feel like with non-metallic metal, I have more compositional options. Like I said, it feels a bit more like illustration and interpretation becomes a factor, while true metallic metal typically feels a bit more realistic maybe, and better suited for nitty and gritty themes, and gets trickier and more difficult for polished paint jobs. One thing I found interesting is that with the true metallic metal, I thought using red on the clothes would be too monochrome, which is why I went with the blue instead, while the red choice for non-metallic metal worked really well. So that means using one or the other will have an influence on the rest of the color composition and which colors you choose. As I already mentioned, there is slightly less time investment to get a decent looking metallics. Non-metallic metals initially take a bit more knowledge and a bit longer time to get right. Basic metallics look good even with just a base layer and wash approach. Basic non-metallic metal done this way usually does not look good, and this is where I think a lot of animosity towards non-metallic metal comes from. Perfecting metallics, however, takes a long time too. I hope this video was interesting to you, and hopefully you learned a few new tricks for your own painting. Let me know in the comment section what the most helpful aspect was, because I always like to see what resonates the most with my audience to make the videos even better. Don't forget that leaving a like and a comment helps a lot with spreading the word and with growing the channel. And of course, you can also support the creation of more videos like this by joining my Patreon campaign, which has tons of extra rewards like full Discord access and all the in-depth guides. That's all I have for this video. Keep pushing that pigment and don't be afraid, it's only paint.